Thanks for joining me today. I wanted to talk a little bit today about what the big battle is that's going on Earth right now is globalism versus the nation state, and some allegiances that we're seeing, some traditional old allegiances we're seeing form again, and then take that and put Brexit in that context. If we look at who the big globalists are right now, I would say it's Germany sitting smack dab in the middle of Europe and wanting to control Europe. And the people that are now coming to the defense of the nation state, starting with Russia, was Russia. And then with Brexit, you see Britain now defending the nation state. With the election of Donald Trump, you see United States now defending wholeheartedly the nation state. Now, what happens if Marine Le Pen in France gets in? You are going to see France now defending the nation state, with the only remaining globalist, and I would say the most staunch globalist nation out there being Germany, and Germany primarily because of what Angela Merkel is getting up to. But these are the same old allies and enemies of World War I, when Germany tried to control Europe, World War II, when Germany tried to control Europe, and now we have the same thing, I think, with the EU taking shape, in which Germany is once again, sitting there smack dab in the middle of Europe, trying to control all of Europe. But instead of with a kinetic war, she's trying to, Germany via Angela Merkel, or Angela Merkel via Germany, I should say, trying to control all of Europe with political means, economic means, financial means, right? And so if we look at this same old allies allying, against the same old enemies, then take Brexit in that context, and it makes me think that Britain never actually intended on staying in the EU. Okay, if you go back and have a look, this is what started me thinking down this road. If you go back and have a look at David Cameron after the big shock and awe of the Brexit vote, where everybody was in shock and dismayed because Britain was leaving the EU. The following day, David Cameron, I should say, outside of number 10 Downing, had a press conference, and in that press conference, I did not see any signs of a disappointed man at all. He kept talking. He kept pointing out that he wished the vote hadn't gone that way, and that he said, everybody knows that I wanted a different outcome. I don't buy it. I think he's just outright lying. I don't think he ever had any intent of staying in the EU. Not just him, but the deep state of Britain. I don't think they ever had any intent. And the same, like in that press conference, he looked like a completely invigorated individual. To say he looked pleased would be going too far, but in the thinking I have of it now, he was pleased. Okay, that was the first step in a number of steps that were going to take place, and he looked totally invigorated with those steps. It looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. There was no shock, there was no disappointment. I'm talking about his facial cues, his whole demeanor, his body movements and all that, to me, were the sign of a very confident person that had the first steps of an endeavor underway, and it was time to go. It was time to get this job done. And if you look at the very next day, 2 days after Brexit, when he first addresses Parliament, his demeanor is exactly the same. It's the same thing. He's up there. He's not confrontational, but there's definitely this idea that this is going to happen. We're going ahead forward. I never really wanted it to go this way, but now that it has, we have to go with the British people. We're going. And again, he looks totally invigorated. There's nothing about his demeanor that looks disappointed, depressed about it in any way, shape, or form. We're talking about his entire nation disengaging from Europe. If he really wanted it to go the other way, you'd think you would see some kind of remorse, but I saw no sign of remorse whatsoever. So that's what started me down the track of thinking that the deep state never had any intent of Britain staying in Germany. They, I would suggest, inserted themselves into the European Union like a pin into a hand grenade. Okay, they inserted themselves in there like a self-ejecting pin into a hand grenade. That was the whole point of it. They needed to get inside the EU, so they knew what the moves were going to be of the EU. They knew what the timeline was going to be in the EU, and they could position themselves better to destroy the EU when the time came to destroy the EU, and Brexit was the time. That's when they pulled the pin. And if you look at what has happened to the EU ever since Brexit, even though, you know, the British currency stabilized, that's another point as well, is why didn't Britain take on the euro? Why did they not adopt the currency of the EU? Why? Because they never planned on staying in the EU for any permanent, in any permanent sense. They needed to get into the EU. Like when you're going to destroy your enemy, a lot of the time in war, you infiltrate it. That's all they were doing by joining the EU, was infiltrating the EU. So they knew everything that was going on the inside of the EU. In the meantime, they would make their plans. And at the right time, when you had things like the banks in the EU blowing up, okay, a number of countries that are totally dissatisfied with the EU in terms of the people, not necessarily the governments, but in terms of the people. Like the Italian people are sick and tired of the EU, the Greek people, obviously, the Spanish people, the Portuguese people. Ireland isn't saying anything through the government, but I'm pretty sure they're not all that happy with what's happened since they've gotten in the EU. The French people, I don't think, are particularly happy. That's why Marine Le Pen is making the advances that she is. So, and when you also throw on top of that this influx of fake war refugees that are in fact financial refugees, economic refugees, just showing up in Britain, or sorry, in the EU to get their money in Britain as well. You know, this has all been orchestrated by the EU, fundamentally the de facto EU head, Angela Merkel, the globalist, and she keeps pushing and pushing and pushing as if this is all great. There's nothing wrong with this. So right at the time people are completely disgusted with the EU, what happens? Britain pulls the pin on that hand grenade and has a vote to leave the EU. And it's just been falling apart ever since. I think they're just scrambling to hold that mess together. So I've seen, you know, people make a lot of commentary on Brexit, why it went that direction. I've even seen one really sharp gentleman by the name of Dr. Joseph Farrell point out that, you know, just shortly before the EU, the Queen summoned the Deputy Prime Minister to tea and asked point blank, apparently, in this meeting, you know, give me 3 good reasons for Britain to remain in the EU. And this conversation was leaked out to the media. Well, you know, things get leaked out to the media for a reason, because they want the British public to know about this. So I think the signs were there that Britain was actually going to leave, but they couldn't portray that. Right? They had to make it look right to the end that the stay side was going to win. The deep state, I mean, would have to make it look like that, so that people would never really truly fight the leave side. And the element that I'm adding to it is the step back in time, where Britain saw that Germany was yet again trying to control Europe, except for this time, like I say, through the EU, through politics, through economics, through finance, and needed to combat that situation. And the best way for them to combat it was to insert themselves in the EU and then extract themselves out of the EU at the right time to create the most amount of damage. And I think they've done it. I think they've been successful. That's my take on the situation. I haven't seen anybody else theorize on that possibility yet. And I'm just wondering, you know, is my idea in that regard valid? I think it is. What's your opinion on that? Do you think that's a possibility? Do you think that Britain, yet again, with their covert intelligence operations, was way ahead of a lot of people out there, and actually has, engaged in a masterstroke to destroy the EU? So give me your comments. Let me know what you think. That's how I'm seeing things at this time. Thanks for joining me, folks.